Now we will move to our next speaker, who's Robert Ford, a former US ambassador to Syria. And Robert, I would also like to pose a question to you, and your intervention could be a comment on that question or your answer to it. So the US has great power in Syria, but we also see that it's trying to resolve its political disputes with Iran and Russia, and the Syrian people are paying the price for that. The US is focusing on solving these disputes, but they are not taking also efficient steps to end the misery of the Syrian people. Do you have a comment on that?
So, Oroba, I'm going to speak to that at the end. My understanding when we began is that we're talking about humanitarian assistance, and I want to focus on that immediately.
You can first focus on that, and maybe if you want to comment on the question later.
So I'm going to take about 5 or 6 minutes to talk about 4 things that I hope the United States and other Western countries will do, and which I hope organizations like the Arab Organization for Human Rights and others will press Western capitals to do. And then I'm going to take about 3 or 4 minutes and talk about some things Syrians need to do in the face of this humanitarian catastrophe. And let me open by simply expressing my deepest sympathies for Syrians who have suffered so much from not only the civil war, but then this earthquake. It's just heartbreaking. So let me talk a little bit about what I would like to see Western countries, including the United States, do. The first is they're going to need to provide more resources. So far, the U.S. Agency for International Development, Samantha Power, has announced $85 million for Turkey and Syria. That figure is obviously inadequate. It would be inadequate for Turkey alone. It would be inadequate for Syria alone. And for the 2 countries, I look at it as nothing but an initial beginning. And the Congress of the United States is going to have to provide much more assistance given the scale of the disaster. I would like people to remember, and this is important, that the United States has already provided over $16 billion in humanitarian aid to Syria. And I'm going to warn you that when you say nobody helps the Syrians, it is as if you are ignoring big money that Washington has given in the past. You will be much more effective talking to people in Washington if you say, thank you, but we need more, rather than saying no one has ever helped us. It's a little bit of advice from someone with experience in Washington. Second thing which the Americans need to do, and this is really important, is stop waiting for Russia and China to unblock the allowable access routes into Syria. Bab al-Hawa, so far as the one authorized route, the Bashar government on Monday said that they would allow 2 more routes in Bab Salama and Arai. That's great, but I think there needs to be a sort of understanding among Western capitals that international humanitarian law allows them to set aside temporarily concerns about Syrian state sovereignty in order to get life-saving, urgent humanitarian assistance into Syria without a Security Council resolution. And it's not just me saying this. Multiple legal scholars have said this in the past. And in fact, I'm speaking to you from Yale University, and law faculty here at the Yale Law School say the same thing. It is not necessary to get a Security Council resolution ever to get in urgent humanitarian aid into northwestern Syria. I have never understood why the United States continues to wait for Russia on this. They are perfectly capable of building an argument, a strong legal argument, on the basis of international humanitarian law. That would be another thing I think the Americans need to do. A third thing the Americans need to do is to ensure that the American sanctions do not interfere with the operations of humanitarian aid organizers and deliveries into Syria. The Treasury Department in Washington has issued very broad general licenses to facilitate the work of humanitarian aid. We will see how good those licenses work in practice, how well they work in practice. If banks are still nervous about facilitating movements of money to pay for humanitarian assistance and salaries and such things involved in the humanitarian aid effort, the United States Treasury Department is going to have to adjust how it words the general licenses, and it may have to reach out to banks to reassure them that the Treasury is not going to penalize banks for facilitating financial flows in the cause of humanitarian assistance. There's one more thing I'd like the Americans to do, Western countries in general, but certainly the Americans, and that is urgently revise their policy on accepting refugees. The Americans, I think, are in a particularly embarrassing situation here. Last year, 2022, the United States accepted only about 4,300 Syrian refugees. It's a tiny number compared to the number of displaced people, and it is a tiny number compared to the need to help people resettle. It's last year, 4,300. It's a lot better than the Trump administration, where every year they were allowing in less than 500. But the Biden administration should and could do more. And that, I think, it's not going to solve the humanitarian problem in Syria, but it absolutely could help many, many, many Syrian families. So let me turn for just a second before I finish to things which I think Syrians need to do, Syrians in Syria. First, on the Syrian government side, Salima was just talking about the corruption in delivering humanitarian assistance. I think that absolutely has to stop. Part of that is that international foreign aid agencies and organizations need to demand that the Syrian government provide their staffs in Syria wider access without restriction from Syrian security authorities. And that is something which, frankly, could be discussed in the Security Council. It is unacceptable for the Syrian government to block efforts to verify delivery of international humanitarian aid. It's important to remember 90% of the humanitarian aid going in to Syria comes from Western countries, notably the United States and Europe. Japan is also an important donor. The third thing I'd like to see from the Syrian government is that it not restrict cross-line deliveries of humanitarian assistance from Syrian government-controlled areas into opposition-controlled areas in the north and in the northeast. And that too should be a subject of discussion in the Security Council, but not the issue of cross-border aid from Turkey. So there's also things I'd like to see the Syrian opposition do. The first is, and this is really important, is they should stop blocking aid deliveries for political reasons. And I'm talking about the Syrian National Army elements that blocked aid from the autonomous administration. I don't care, frankly, if you like the Syrian Democratic Forces or not. When it comes to delivering humanitarian aid, there is no excuse for blocking convoys into Idlib from the autonomous administration. It's just unacceptable. Second, It is really important. And by the way, I understand that the Hayat Tahrir Hashem did the same thing with cross-line assistance coming up from Syrian government-controlled areas. It's unacceptable. I don't care if HTS or the Syrian National Army don't like the Assad regime. Who likes the Assad regime? No one. But this is a point about saving lives, and blocking humanitarian aid convoys for political reasons is just, as a matter of principle, unacceptable, whether the Syrian government does it or the Syrian opposition. My last point, it's really important for especially the Hayat Tahrir Hashem, but also for Syrian National Army elements to understand security concerns of foreign aid workers. Here in the United States, I'm speaking to you from Connecticut. The memory of Americans who went to Syria to try to help, journalists like Jim Foley or aid workers like Kayla Mueller, and their kidnapping and their subsequent murder is still very fresh. When I was talking to an important American newspaper reporter who has worked in the Middle East for years, I said, you know, we need to get journalists like you into northern Syria. He said, well, what about safety? And he specifically mentioned Jim Foley. So there have to be guarantees of the safety of foreigners who come in, whether they're journalists or aid workers. There have to be measures taken to ensure that they are made safe while they're in the country, and that they have at the same time access so that they can do the monitoring of aid deliveries or do reporting about what's happening on the ground and publicize that here in the United States. I have seen a few reporters from the Washington Post and NPR go into parts of northern Syria around Afrin, and I think a BBC crew just went to Idlib, and I think those are all positive developments, but we need much more of that. So I'm going to stop there, and would you like me now, Robert, to talk about what you asked me?
I don't know, I don't think we have actually enough time.
Okay.
But thank you so much for all the important points that you've raised. I mean, there's so much to talk about, but unfortunately, there's not enough time.